This year, our theme for the conference is Building Bridges for Student Success. And we recently published a book with that same title. And our speaker this morning contributed a chapter to our publication, and that chapter is titled Student Success and Campus Culture. We're happy to have President Tim Hall join us this morning to talk about this topic. He became president of Mercy College in New York in May of this year. And prior to that, he was president of Austin, is it P or Pay? P, that's how I've always said. Okay, Austin P State University in Tennessee. And while there, the university received a number of honors, including being the subject of a national report which highlighted the collaborative environment of the institution. And he has gained national attention as a higher education leader devoted to innovation and student success. And we look forward to hearing from him this morning. Please help me in welcoming President Tim Hall.
Thank you, Sandra. I'm going to move this back so that I don't knock it off. Well, good morning to you all. It's great to see you. I'm happy to be in Louisville. I thought I would be happier. I hate to begin on a negative note, but I just have to get it off my chest and then maybe move on positively. When I received this invitation a while back, I knew I would be living in New York. My wife and I moved there just a few months ago. We are about to endure our first winter in New York. Before New York, Tennessee had been the furthest north we had ever lived. And so I expected to come to Louisville and get a big lungful of warm air and carry it back with me to New York to sort of survive the winter. And I discovered this morning it is colder in Louisville than it is in Manhattan. So that's a disappointment, but I'm going to try to rise above it and move on in spite of that. I want to talk with you a little bit this morning about campus culture and student success and how we might build cultures that are more conducive to student success. And I want you to begin with me by imagining that you are friends with Copernicus, and he's invited you over to his house in 1543, right before he published a revolutionary book with a revolutionary idea. The book was called On the Evolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. And in the book he suggested that instead of thinking that the earth was the center of the universe, which is how everyone thought, that in fact the sun was the center and the earth revolved around that center. And so he substituted a heliocentric view of our solar system for a geocentric view of that solar system. And you and the other friends he's invited to dinner, I'm sure, would have been amazed and found the thought remarkable. But in addition to the remarkableness of the thought itself, I think as you were walking home that night, you might have been asking one another, I wonder what difference that will make. I wonder what difference that revolutionary thought will make on the way we think about everything. There were certainly some people who thought it might make some theological differences. We ultimately discovered that it made huge physical differences in the way that we understood the world and the universe. But that's the power of a revolutionary thought, is the thought not only is revolutionary in itself, but it has the power to generate new thoughts and to reorganize existing thoughts. We, I think, are on the tail end of a revolution in thought about student success. It's not completely absorbed within our campus cultures, but it has spread over the last generation, so it's hard to imagine a place that hasn't at least partially been influenced by the thought of student success. We'll call it the Student Success Revolution because of how significant it can be for the way we think about our affairs. And what it did is it substituted for one way of thinking a new way of thinking. A generation ago, if you would have asked us what we thought the very center, what the very heart of what the academy was and what it was doing, we would have probably said, well, it is the professor teaching. And that was the image in our minds. It is the professor standing in front of the class, teaching motivated students, them taking notes of the professor. And our imagining was mostly about that professor and what he or she did. In our mind, education was a kind of performance that was mostly about what the professor did. And we knew there were good professors and there were not so good professors, but in our mind it was mostly the professor's doing that was the center of everything we did. We learned that there were good professors and not so good professors, and so we began to try to evaluate the professors. But it was the evaluation of the professor that was the center of our thinking, for example, of how we got better. And we tended to think that we got better by getting better professors, helping professors get better. Student evaluations crept in over the last generation or so. The very fact that we were evaluating professors, though, that was the first step to evaluate professors, shows that the professor teaching was at the very center of our thinking. Over this last generation, though, there has been a steady change to put the student learning at the center of our thinking. Now today, if you talk to accreditors, they're not so interested in hearing very first about the professor teaching. They're very interested in hearing about what do you know about what students are learning and how confident are you that they're actually learning. And if you say to them, well, our professors are teaching, they say, well, that's not a sufficient answer to the question of are the students learning? And if you say, well, our professors give tests and grade those tests, that's not a sufficient answer to the question of are the students learning? And if you look around us in the country, there is just a vast interest in students learning, students persisting, students graduating that did not exist a generation ago. This has been a remarkable transition between the professor being at the center of it all and the students now being at the center of it all. How did it happen? Well, it started by us deciding that we could make a difference, that we could actually affect what students learned. There was a time when we sort of thought that we provided access and students walked in and they took advantage of that access, and the ones that were motivated and the ones that were had some academic ability, they would flourish once given that access. That's the way we used to think. But then we discovered that once they arrive, once we've given them access, it's actually possible for us to make a difference on whether they learn. There are things that we can do that are conducive to their learning. There are things that we can do that are not so conducive to their learning. There are things that help them to persist and graduate, things that don't help them persist and graduate. So we began to discover over the last 20 years or so that we could make a difference. We could make a difference. We didn't have to just simply say, come on in, have access, and if you make it, that's okay. If you don't, that really doesn't bother us. We learned that we could make a difference. And then we discovered that we needed to make a difference. Higher education costs have continued to escalate. The need for college graduates have never been greater. We need to make a difference. That's the discovery. There used to be a time where if a whole bunch of our students didn't make it, didn't really bother us. We thought that was just sort of the price of doing business, that we would admit large entering classes, they would not succeed, and we would feel good about that because it showed that we were rigorous and that we had high standards. But we've now discovered that we need more students to make it. We need more students to learn. We need more students to persist and graduate. So the combination of those two principles, that we learned that we could make a difference and that we need to make a difference, resulted in what we'll call the student success imperative. That now people are counting on us to make a difference. People are scrutinizing us on whether we are making a difference, whether it's accreditors or government officials, whether it's Republicans or Democrats. Everyone is looking at us now and expecting that we will make a difference. Now, I have to back up in just a moment and say that we always knew that there were things that made a difference. We all experience the difference between great teachers and not so great teachers, right? We have those in our past. We knew that excellent teachers made a difference. But there was a long time when we didn't have a good feel for what we might do to encourage more excellence and less of the not so excellent kind of teaching. Now we know that there are things that can be done because we know and because we have a need. There's now a nationwide imperative that we produce more student success. And student success, you know, now over the last 5 or 10 years or so has sort of migrated towards the completion agenda. We need students not simply to succeed in their first year, but to graduate with a college degree. Because we know the worst thing that can happen for a student is not to get some debt, all right? The whole debt thing, I think, has been way overplayed, and the data doesn't support the kind of fear that's being talked about in publications about how much debt students are getting. But what is absolutely true, the worst thing that could happen for students is to acquire a boatload of debt and a few college credits but no college degree. That's the real crisis in the country, is those students who are getting college debt but no college degree. So we now have this student success imperative. Now what I want to talk to you about is just the thought that at the heart of culture is thinking. That if you want to affect the culture of institution, almost always you have to affect the thinking of an institution. And we have all now embedded in our institutions a revolutionary thought, and that is the thought that it is the student learning which is at the center of what we do. The accreditors are pushing us toward that thought, government officials, that's the thought. But here's the reality, right? It's possible to have inconsistent thoughts running around in your mind, and it's possible to have inconsistent thoughts running around in an institution's mind. I discovered this last night, right? I had a 3-hour layover in Washington, D.C. I'm thinking to myself about 5 o'clock, you know, a big salad would make me feel more energetic. It would do lots of good for my weight. That's probably what I should think about. And I had that thought right until the moment I migrated around the food court and discovered that there was a Five Guys there. And then I thought to myself, you know, I've got a 3-hour layover. I'm suffering here, you know, that time. I need some kind of consolation. And the Five Guys hamburger with grilled jalapenos and some French fries, that's precisely what I need. Both thoughts can run around in my head at exactly the same time. And part of success is corralling the right thought and giving it the sort of prominence that it needs. The same thing goes on in institutions. We've now all embedded the thought of student success, the thought that student learning is at the center of our operations. But I promise you, because I've been in institutions, we have all sorts of thoughts still running around that I would call pre-revolutionary thoughts. They are thoughts that existed before that revolutionary thought, and they still exist, and they still have power to affect conduct and behavior on our campuses. So part of the goal of creating a campus culture supportive of student success is to create an environment where the revolutionary thought that the student learning is at the center of what we do has the power to generate ideas supportive of that thought that will actualize that thought. So I'm going to share with you just some ideas about the different kinds of the pre-revolutionary thought and the post-revolutionary thought that may exist on your campus. I know they've existed on campuses where I've served. But before we talk about that, we have to talk about what's the primary challenge as we seek to amplify student success on our campuses. And if we don't talk about this, we probably won't deal with it in the ways that we need to deal with it. And here's what our challenge is. It is demography, right? The demographics of our students has an immense amount of impact on the goal of student success. And to the extent that we don't acknowledge that and talk about it, to the extent that people who are deciding what a good institution is and what a not good institution is, that they don't talk about this subject, we will all be in a bad shape. It's student demographics. And I'll just share with you the most dominant demographic threat to student success, and it's the demography of wealth. We know this. Tom Mortensen of Post-Secondary Education Opportunities lays it out in a way that you can't escape. He says, his research suggests that in this country, if you are a C student graduating from high school in the top quartile of family incomes, you are better than 80% likely to get a college degree. If, on the other hand, you are an A student graduating from high school in the bottom quartile of family incomes in this country, you are less than 9% likely to graduate from college. Now, my friends, I don't know how America works if that kind of math continues to rule, but those are the demographic realities on our campuses. If you just look at the issue of Pell Grant recipients, you don't have to see the details of this chart. The tall bar represents a graduation rate of 80%. And that graduation rate is represented by institutions that have either 0 to 20% of Pell recipients. The smallest bar toward the far right represents the institutions who have the most Pell recipients, better than 80%. The graduation rates, the 6-year rates for those institutions are 25% or less. Those are the stark demographic realities of our context. And so our challenge is going to be to respond to those demographics. It seems to me that we have 3 possible responses. First, we can accept demography. We can say, okay, students from poor families are not likely to make it to college. They're certainly not likely to make it out of college. There's nothing we can do about that. It's just a sad fact about the way the world works. We know that college has a lot to do with financial resources and whether you can weather the various things that happen to you along the way as you're a college student, when your car breaks down, or you lose your bus pass in New York that will allow you to get to campus. We know financial realities like that affect our students' lives, but there's not very much that we can do about that. And so we say, that's just demography. We can't change that. We can't change it at all. There used to be a time in K through 12 education where we thought similar kinds of things. We thought kids from poor families just didn't do well. We saw that to be so. And we sort of had it in our mind, there's not much that can be done about that. Fortunately, over the last 20 years or so, we know that there are things that can be done about it. It is possible for schools and teachers to make a real difference against demography. We don't have to accept it. But there are still folks, there are still institutions that have largely accepted demography and say there's not much we can do about demographic differences in student success. The next thing we can do is try to avoid demography. You avoid demography primarily by structuring your affairs so you have fewer poor students. Can I say it bluntly? That's how you do it. You either have a high enough tuition rate and low enough financial aid so not many poor students get to you. And if you do that, you will have higher graduation rates. I can promise you that. That's what the data suggests, right? That if you have less low-income students, you will have higher graduation rates. Does that mean that you're good, that you're a great institution? No, it simply means you have less low-income students. You have managed to avoid the effects of demography. There's no pride in that. There's no glory in it. America doesn't work if we all just avoid demography. If when we hear politicians and system heads tell us, you need to raise our retention rates, you need to raise your retention rates. If we turn around and say, okay, we need to raise our admission rates, our admission requirements, that's simply a way of trying to escape demography. And it may work for your institution. I suspect it won't, because that pool of students is getting smaller and smaller every year. And the folks who are trying to avoid demography are doomed to be chasing a smaller and smaller pool of students, and they will not be doing the country any good. The country needs for folks to step up and say, we have one final option, and that is to defeat demography. We are going to work overtime to see that income is not a determinant of who gets a college degree in this country. That family resources don't bar a student from getting into a college or graduating from a college. We can defeat demography. We know this. We know it in the K through 12 system, where we've seen exemplars in our public schools, in our private schools, that are taking some of the poorest kids in the country, and they are helping them succeed. The same thing goes for higher education. This is hard work, I promise you. I've been in some places now that have had large numbers of low-income students that are battling against demography. I know about the frustrations of doing that. I know the challenges facing our students. But unless someone steps up and said, we will make it our game to defeat demography. It remains undefeated. And we keep getting the results that we've been seeing so far, which is this vast difference in the folks who graduate based upon their family wealth backgrounds. We don't want that. We don't have to accept it. So, you're going to talk, and you have talked in this conference about all sorts of strategies for achieving student success, for defeating demography. I don't plan to go into those. You will do that in some of our sessions around here, and you've done that before. I want us to talk about the broader question of how the institutional thought affects student persistence and student graduation. So we'll think of these as sort of pre-revolutionary thought and post-revolutionary thought. Pre-revolutionary thought about student success, student persistence, student graduation was, it doesn't really matter to us. Now, we're not bad people, mind you. We all want our students to succeed. Every professor who stands in front of a class wants to see her students succeed. But there is a sense in which the pre-revolutionary thought, before we focused on student learning, the pre-revolutionary thought was, if they don't succeed, ultimately, that doesn't affect me. It doesn't affect my institution. We will go along just fine even if a lot of our students don't make it. That's the pre-revolutionary thought. The thought now is it really matters to us. And I'm not saying this just as a president. I'm saying this as a member of an academic community and groups of community. It matters to us whether our students succeed. The day is long past when a dean of a law school would stand up and say, as deans of law schools used to say about the time I was going to law school, look to your right. He would say this, it was normally a he, not a she. He would say this, look to your right, look to your left. One of those students will not be here at the end of the semester. And he would smile. He would smile, right? And why was he smiling? Because the fact that a third of the class didn't make it was a badge of honor. That was a sign that we were vigorous, that we had high standards, that we wouldn't let students just skate through, that they had to bring their A game if they were going to succeed with us. That's the way we thought a generation ago. It's very hard to find a dean to say such a thing today. It's very, very hard. Because realities have made us aware that if a third of our students leave, it's not a good thing for us. It's not a thing that we just wave our hands and say, oh, okay, that's just their problem, it's not our problem. We know it is our problem. Do you know the math works on your campuses the same as it works for my campus? On my campus right now at Mercy College, where we charge $17,000 of tuition a year, 4 students retained is about the equivalent of a new faculty hire or a new staff hire. That's what it means. So when our faculty say they're overworked and they need more folks to serve the students coming, I say to them, 4 students. That's what a new faculty hire requires, 4 students retained. That's how it affects our finances. And sometimes we scoff about finances and just sort of put that off on presidents, but we know that all the things that we do require money to give scholarships to students, to run programs that sustain student success, to hire faculty, to hire instructional technologists. All of those things take money, and that money comes, one way it comes is from tuition, and one way we get tuition dollars is just by helping students continue on with us so that they continue as people who are paying tuition to us. It makes a difference financially to us whether our students succeed. It makes a difference to us reputationally whether our students succeed. You've seen this over the last decade, that just with ever increasing frequency, people are rating us. They are grading us. Lots of this grading seems to me nonsense. It seems to me nonsense to grade an institution that is defeating demography the same way you grade an institution that doesn't have to bother with demography because it just has folks who aren't under demographic threats. And sometimes we've been graded like that. But increasingly, folks are pondering the question of how do we recognize institutions who are doing a good job in this area? You know, the White House has a scorecard right now where it will publish your 6-year graduation rate, where it publishes the average debt monthly payment of student loans that your students pay upon graduation, where it publishes your default rate. There's a grade out block that the White House expects to fill in the future, which will say something about the ability of your graduates to get degrees. So we are being scored constantly. We know the current administration is about to come out with a more formal way of rating institutional performance. So the days when you could see lots of your students walk away and you suffer no consequence, those days are going and gone. I came from a state, Tennessee, which had in January of 2010 passed one of the most aggressive performance funding models in the state, where 100% of the state funding flowed through a performance funding model that was primarily based upon student persistence and student graduation. That movement of performance funding kind of models is flowing around the country. Nobody else has done it quite as aggressively as Tennessee, but it's coming your way. And so the thought that students not making it doesn't affect you is simply pre-revolutionary thought. It is inconsistent with the realities of our day. The realities of our day is it matters very much whether our students succeed. And so one of the work of building a positive campus culture that supports student success is to help that thought, that it matters to us whether our students succeed, help that thought take root in our campuses. We used to kind of look down on our students sometimes. Have you heard anybody say in one of your offices, it's on the web? It's on the web? And this is always said with a kind of disdain, like, don't you realize it's on the web? And you want to respond back to them and you say, which of the 40 billion pages precisely are you talking about it being on? I don't have the bookmarks on my computer that you have in your office because you go to this page all the time. I'm going to tell you a personal bit of testimony, and that is, I've had college kids. I've now seen 2 of them through. My first one went to a private college in Texas, Trinity University. He got a pretty good scholarship. Every year, though, I had to take out student loans to pay for that tuition. So every semester, I had to go apply for a new student loan. Every semester, I had to eventually call up the financial aid office and say, did I get it? Did I do it? Is it done? Have I accomplished everything I know? And they would always say, yes, Mr. Hall, you've gotten it done. But there was never anything on the web that would tell me that. I had to make a personal call. More recently, my daughter was a student at Austin Peay where I was the president. I was the president. You know, a fairly knowledgeable consumer of academic services. So I remember vividly sitting with my daughter in the president's office. I'm on the computer. I am pulling out my debit card to make the tuition payment, typed in my number, and I did all the things to make sure that she got paid. And then I waited for a ding or a message or something that would say, you've done it, you've done it. You don't have to be worried that when we knock the students out who haven't paid. Do you do that? We do this in the places where I've come. We call it the purge. The purge is where we essentially take all of the work of advising and take all the work that students have put into finding the right courses and getting them, and then we sort of pour it out on the floor. That's what the purge is. And if you get purged because you haven't paid, then you have to go back and try to build that schedule back up again. I didn't want that from my daughter, right? I didn't want that. So I have to say to my daughter in the president's office, honey, go run down to the bursar's office and see if we've done it. And she has to go down to the financial aid office and find out whether what I thought I had done, I'd actually done, because I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure, even though I know a lot about universities and a lot about financial aid and paying tuition and all that, I wasn't sure. That's the way it exists on most of our campuses. We have this notion that we've made it easy over the years, that it's a lot easier now to be a college student. Because what some of us remember is we remember the gym. The gym and the tables And above all else, the lines that you stand in for 2 hours and you get to the front and they say, oh, this is not the right table. You should be at the table over there. And we went to the table over there and we just prayed that the other person had given us the right advice and that the 2 hours we spent in that line would not be wasted. We remember that. We know we don't have those kinds of lines anymore. And we think we've made it better. We've made it easier. But I'm not so sure. Do you remember when you walked out of the gym those years ago after all the lines and all the tables? You pretty much had your schedule and you knew it. It was done. There wasn't a lot of residual stuff that had to happen because nobody let you leave that place until you had stood in every line that was possible. We don't have the human cost anymore of standing in front of all those lines because we put it on the web. But we have huge and tremendous error cost. It's so much easier to screw up. It's so much easier to not do what you need to do and not to know that you've not done what you needed to do today than it ever was. I can tell you this as somebody who practiced law for a while and was a law professor for many years. Before we think about being kind of condescending to our students, and I've actually talked with faculty whose attitude is, and I know there are staff who have the same attitude, that if they can't navigate our system, maybe they're not worthy of a college degree. If they can't figure out our web pages, if they can't get to the various offices that we have set up, maybe they're not ready to be college graduates of our institution. Let me tell you this as a lawyer and a law professor. Not a lawyer anymore. Don't tell my faculty I'm a lawyer anymore. That would get me in trouble. But I'll tell you this as somebody who's practiced law and somebody who's been a law professor. The most complicated transaction most people will ever experience in their lives is the transaction of gaining admission to and financial aid to an institution of higher learning. It's one of the toughest ones out there. It's easier to adopt a child. Takes longer, but it's easier, not so many moving pieces. It's easier to set up a small corporation than it is to get into college and get financial aid. So there is not the slightest basis for looking down on our students if they have trouble. There's not the slightest basis for us not to be looking under the hood to find these places where it's being hard for our students because they are worthy of college degrees. We're the ones who are the problem because we're making it too hard and continue to make it too hard even though it's on the web. That's pre-revolutionary thinking to think that it's easy as we think it is. Here's another pre-revolutionary way of thinking. And you hear this one a lot because in the climate that we are in, we're increasingly being pushed to raise our retention rates. We're increasingly being threatened with performance-based funding. And so what do people say when they get this pressure for higher retention rates and graduation rates and when they're pressed about performance funding that maybe part of their money will come from how well they do with retention and persistence? The thing I hear most commonly here today in the post-revolutionary world, the thing I hear more commonly is, well, we need to get some better students. We need to raise our standards. That's the way we will solve that problem. We don't really have any other choice. We have to get better students because there is no other way of increasing retention or persistence than to get better students. Now, most of you don't think this because you're coming to a retention conference, but I promise you, there are staff members, there are faculty members on your campus who think precisely this, who think that the only way to increase retention and persistence is to lower our standards or get better students. You've heard the lowering the standards thing, right? You've heard people who say that all the pressure to get better retention is just a pressure to lower our standards. For the life of me, I don't understand that. To me, that is the equivalent of the student who says the only way I can get better grades is to cheat. And you want to say to that student, well, let me tell you, you've got a few other options out there, you know? And cheating is not the only one. You could spend a little more time studying. You could go get some tutoring. You could go hang out in the library a little bit. The notion that we have to lower standards in order to create more retention and persistence comes from people who don't know what's possible for us to do. You in this room probably know a little bit of what's possible to do. And we know that it's possible to increase the retention and persistence and learning of our students without getting better students. When I was interviewing for my current job, that's actually one of the things I was listening very closely to, because there are plenty of places who think the only way to get better is to get better students. That, of course, is the way U.S. News and World Rankings work, absolutely, right? That's essentially an exclusion device. You get better by excluding weaker students. So this way of thinking is rampant in our institutions, but it is simply wrong. It is wrong. You can get better by getting better. And so at the institution, I was listening very closely to the board because I wanted to know, do you want me just to go out there and try to recruit some more high-performing students? There are lots of reasons for recruiting high-performing students, but you don't need high-performing students to increase your retention rates or your persistence rates. You just need to do the things that help students learn more, persist more, and graduate more. So that's an example of pre-revolutionary thought and post-revolutionary thought. We can get better by getting better. I don't know if you know this movie, Kate and Leopold. It's a time travel movie where a guy, a kind of gentleman from the past, comes into the future. Once he gets into the future, he gets connected to a young man who wants to date a girl. And so the time traveler is kind of giving him some advice about how to date the girl. And one moment they're walking along the street late at night, and the young man calls up the girl on a phone, and she's not there, and he leaves her a message saying he'd like to go out with her. And he hangs up the phone and says, "There, the ball's in her court now." And the older, wiser man from the past says, "You don't want the ball to be in her court, you want the ball to be in your court." The same is true for us. We want the ball to be in our court. So long as we believe that the answer to our persistence, our success problems, our learning problems is with students who come to us underprepared, who come to us from situations where they're not really ready to do college work, as long as we think that's the real problem, the ball's in their court and we can't do much about it. Except we can reimagine our context to understand that the ball is in our court. We all have students who come to us who are not college ready in particular areas. This has been going on for a generation. It hasn't stopped. There are no signs that it will stop in the immediate future. Do we simply say, oh, they're not college ready, there's nothing we can do, the ball's in their court? No, we don't. We've been doing things. And we're getting better and better at understanding what we have to do to help students make it who are not college ready in math or English or whatnot. The same goes for almost all of our issues. The more we visualize the ball is in the student's court, they're the ones who have to make this happen, we are disempowered. But the more we understand, we can't ever escape student responsibility and their need to be motivated, but there are things we can do to motivate them. We can't escape the fact that they have to be willing to learn, but we can inspire them to learn. We can keep the ball in our court, and by keeping it in our court, we do the kinds of things that will produce more success among our students. Honestly, if you look at a typical higher education classroom and take a photo of it today, it doesn't look terribly different than a classroom that you took 100 years ago today. 100 years ago. The pictures, I've seen these. I've seen a lecture hall from years and years ago, decades ago, and I've seen a lecture hall in the institutions where I've been. And besides the fact that now there's a PowerPoint, there's not much difference. It's the same students in the seats. It's the same professor up at the front. We're basically pretty satisfied with the way that we've been doing things. Because for most of us who ultimately migrated into higher education, we succeeded in that environment, which has stayed roughly static. We made it. I remember my first history class in college had 500 students in it. I was one student in the darkness. The professor never saw me, never spoke to me, never said a word that was directed personally toward Tim Hall. He just lectured. And I flourished because he was a great lecturer, because I was able to take good notes, because the books that he assigned for us to read kind of came to life in my mind. But I wasn't the norm. I was one of those kind of people who flourished in that environment. But the majority of folks don't flourish in that environment. They don't. We know it. We absolutely know it. My first psychology course had 1,000 students in it. I went to a videotape library, and I checked out a video 3 times a week, and I watched the professor lecture. And finally, on the date of the final exam, I came in and I took a multiple choice test, and I went up on the stage and smiled at him as I walked by it to put it in the machine that would spit out my grade. That's not the way to do education, and we know it. We've known it for a long time. And so we're no longer satisfied, because we know Thomas Edison said it right when he said, "Discontent is the first necessity of progress. Show me a truly satisfied man, and I will show you a failure." I once brought the house down in a big scholarship dinner where I had a lot of alumni and supporters in, and not very many faculty, when I told the alumni and supporters about how I was having to work with a bunch of discontented faculty and staff. And they thought, "Ooh, boy, that's a bold man to say something like that." Until I went on to say, we have faculty and staff who are working overtime every day to rethink what we're doing in ways that make it more likely that our students will succeed. That's the way you think after the student success revolution. You don't just go into our offices every day and say, "Well, we've been doing this for a long time. Let's just keep doing it for a long time." Every day, you and I are thinking of ways that we can reimagine the things that we're doing so we can produce more student success. I was a law faculty member. You've never seen people argue if you haven't seen law faculty argue. I mean, we raise it to a level of professional skill to argue about the curriculum. I remember sitting in endless faculty meetings arguing about what would be best for our students to learn, how the best way it would be to teach them to learn, and we would just go at it, just endlessly. Today, in this sort of post-revolutionary world of student success, we're just kind of tired of that. And places, at least, that understand what's at stake and understand how we can learn more about what succeeds that's kind of moving away from that. The first question I want to ask now when somebody proposes a new way for us to do things, we have plenty of those going on at the campus where I am, right? We know students are not learning in some of our gateway courses, and so we're going to try to reimagine those courses so that they will learn more. And the first question I ask, and the first question other people are prepared to think about, is how are we going to know if that works? How will we know if it actually produces more student learning? The folks who are engaging in this endless, angels on the head of a pin kind of debate are living in the pre-revolutionary world. Today, we have more and more resources available to know what's working and not what's working, and that's what we think we need to get at. I'm a little less sure of this, but let me talk with you just briefly about campus culture and leadership. Not as a way of talking about maybe presidents who aren't here and that you work with, but about talking about you, because many of you, if not most of you, are leaders in some context. I think there is a pre-revolutionary way thinking about campus leadership and a post-revolutionary thinking today as we understand the stakes standing before us. In the pre-revolutionary way of thinking, it wasn't uncommon for institutions to be fairly top-down, and if we want to accomplish things, presidents send out memos, or if you want to accomplish things in your area, you want to send out the memo yourself or get the president to send it out for you. That's sort of the way we did our business in higher education. It's very hierarchical. More and more, I'm convinced that if we're going to see the success that we want to see for our students, it's going to mean reimagining our campus cultures in the area of leadership, where we focus more on organic initiatives and less on top-down mandates. Here's the truth. You remember that word cloud I threw up before, which is just a small example of some of the things that we've discovered are working to help our students persist and graduate? Some of the items in that word cloud will stay on that list for years to come, probably, because they've been on it for a while. We've discovered if you'll give students a first-year kind of experience to introduce them to college, you'll help more of them make it. We've known that for 20 years. John Gardner helped us to understand this 20 years or so ago. We've been doing that kind of work, and that's probably going to stay on the list. Today, we're thinking about different sorts of things. We're thinking about, okay, how do we redesign gateway courses to help students learn more in there? What does the learning look like in a redesigned course? How do we import more active learning into our courses? How do we use data more to predict where students are likely to fail or not fail and help intervene accordingly? I worked with a very talented provost at my last institution who created a piece of software that does sort of what Netflix and Amazon and Pandora do, to use collaborative filtering to compare every student's grades with every other student, and on the basis of that to make some very accurate predictions about what a student will do in any particular course. And you can either use that information to try to guide the student toward a more appropriate course, a more appropriate major, or you can use it to provide interventions that will help the student succeed in spite of what the data seems to look like. Those are things that we're exploring with today. But the solutions of the future will not be one or two top-down driven sorts of items. They will be ideas that come from the multiplicity of thinkers we have on our campus, who are each toiling in their areas to find new ways of serving our students to help more of our students succeed. What's happening in many of our campuses today, because accountability pressures are high, is that pre-revolutionary way of doing things is very strong. I promise you, I'm under enormous pressure from a board to see success in the area of student success. They won't tolerate me hanging around for years and years and years and our students not graduating at the same rate that they've been not graduating. They won't tolerate me. They'll find somebody else to do the work. So what does that incline me to do? What does it incline your presidents to do, or your provosts to do, your deans, or whoever you are? It inclines us to write the memo with the big idea and say, go do this. Here's how we're going to solve this problem. I'm lying awake at night thinking of things that might help more of our students succeed. And I'm very tempted in the morning to go write the memo that says, here's the way it's going to do. And then a couple of weeks later, I'll have a new thought, and I'll write a new memo, and I'll send that one out. And what happens is that institutions all over the country in this area of student success are they're tired. They're tired. They wonder, when will it all end? It's not going to end is the answer to that question, but that doesn't alleviate the tiredness. And part of the tiredness comes from people like presidents not paying attention to work. When I send out a memo and suggest that people need to work a new way, and they need to add something to the things that they're doing, they rightfully look back at me and they say, well, what do you think I should stop doing to make time to do the thing that you've just asked me to do? And they almost never hear that from presidents. They almost never hear it from leaders. Leaders never take the time to talk about the work and where we should reassign our efforts to produce more success. But that's what the future is going to require. It's going to require organic initiatives. I'm not smart enough to think of them all for my campus, and you're not for your campus. Whatever position you're in, you need other people collaborating with you on ideas for success. And it ultimately requires us all working together here. I discovered Lao Tzu's quote about leadership when I was in junior high, and it has affected me ever since. He said that a leader is best when you hardly know he exists. It's not so good when people acclaim the leader, worse when people despise the leader. But of a good leader, when he finishes his task and is complete with the course, the people will all say, we did this ourselves. We did this ourselves. That's what the campus of the future that's going to see student success prevail is going to be like, I'm convinced. It's going to be a place where people say, we did this ourselves. So let me just conclude by saying this. We talk about retention rates and graduation rates, but it's good for us from time to time just to back up and say it's about each individual student. John Henry Newman wrote a famous book called The Idea of the University, and he said in the book, a university is an alma mater, nursing or nurturing mother. A university is an alma mater, knowing her children one by one, not a foundry or a mint or a mill. So ultimately, although we talk about statistics and rates and data, it's helpful always to come back to the reality that it's one woman who's a single parent, and she's holding down a job, and she wonders how she will pay her tuition next semester. That's who our attention is on. It's one student who came from a family who never had a college grad before. He doesn't know what a library looks like. He doesn't know what our registration web pages are about. But it's his success that our success hinges upon. I love the audacity of Steve Jobs, who said, "I want to put a ding in the universe." Now, as I recall that word ding, that's the word you used to your father after you kind of did something with the car. "Dad, I put a ding in the car." And it had the connotations of, it's not a big thing, Dad. I want you to it's just a little thing. And I think that's the same connotation that Jobs has. But the audacity is the ding he wants to put is in the universe. The universe. My friends, I want to challenge you. If we're going to defeat demography in this country by helping more of our students succeed, by helping more of them learn, persist, and graduate, somebody's got to put a ding in our universe. It's a big problem, and I don't want to underestimate it. I've seen retention rates in my institutions go up and then down suddenly for reasons hard to understand. It's a big problem, but somebody has to tackle it. I am proud to be in a room of people who are tackling what I think is one of the great issues of our day, one of the great civil rights issues of our day, is how we help more American men and women graduate from college. Thank you very much. I think they've arranged for us to have a few minutes if someone has some comments or some questions or some thoughts about this subject. Afterwards, we have some other presentations, but those of you who would like to talk about this subject can remain here and we'll talk in a more extended fashion. But there are comments or questions now, I'd be happy to entertain them. We have some, if we can get a mic down here. Otherwise, I will surely not be able to hear you. Do we have a mic? Here it comes.
Hi, I just want to say thank you, and I hope, Sandra, you recorded that, because every time that I get a little discouraged, I'm going to listen to your speech. I really didn't think it was possible to feel more passionate about student success, and thank you. It was amazing, and I think that it was very motivational for all of us, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let me also echo that. Thank you very much. But here's my question. In the post-revolutionary student success era, the other thing, in addition to demographics, the other thing that we're facing now is sort of the mantra, do more with less. How do you see those two going together?
Well, I'm probably in the same room of folks who believe that we are doing our future a great disservice by what we're doing in terms of higher education funding. And so when I have occasion to talk to people who have influence in that area, I try to say that, and I hope you say that. We understand the budget pressures on our country. I think we understand all the things that are going on, but in state governments, for example, in the state I came from, and I suspect this is so in the state I came to, is that's the big four expenses. There is K through 12, there is higher education, there is health, and there's prisons. Those are the big four expenses. Of those four expenses, the two that have the most investment capacity of affecting the future that we will all live in are the education ones. But I try to keep the ball in my court, right? If I spend too much time thinking about how we're underfunded and too much time being paralyzed by the fact that I can't do anything until they give me some more money, and they're taking it away more and more. In my last state, we lost 30% of our state funding over the course of just several years. And if you get caught up too much in thinking like that, you're paralyzed. So I believe we have to try to not only advocate for higher education funding, but also understand the ball is in our court, and that funding or no, there are things that we can do. There are things that we can do that will affect our student success. Anyone else? He's coming up behind you.
Thank you once again for your talk. It was very inspiring. I think from my point of view, it was inspiring because you are also the president of a college or university. And I think I'd like to ask you a question about change management. I think as we all at our levels look at what changes we can do to think about the student, you talked about a leader needs to maybe get out of the way and let that happen. That could be a change management issue amongst the president, their executives, and so forth. Do you have any examples that you can share with us, or things that you're doing to change the mentality of some of that 1980s thinking, that autocratic thinking? It's got to come from me and nobody else. Innovation needs to come from everybody and to float the boat and move on. But how do we do change management within an existing environment at the management level?
Yeah, there's a lot we could say here. I'll just mention a couple of things. Is one, because I believe with all my heart that it's going to take ideas coming from all of us to address this issue of how we help more students succeed. There are things that an institution can do to kind of empower more people. I have used micro grants with great success to try to build a culture where we're thinking about what we might do differently, and where we try to engage some of our most passionate people early on to look for new ways of doing things. And so things that create those sorts of incentives to cast institutional attention, not on the president's office and the memos coming out of the president's office, but of the innovations coming out of our junior faculty in biology, for example. I think that's one thing. The other thing is, I just think it's absolutely crucial that we create cultures, and you can do this, but it takes the leaders at every level to do it, is you have to create a culture where fail is not frowned upon. Failure is not frowned upon. If we attempt new things, we're going to fail. We know it. We know it with a certainty. Not everything will work. If I get reports back from all the programs that we try and I see a story being told that all of them worked, I'm skeptical, because that's not the way life works, right? Normally, if you try some new things, most of them are going to fail. There has to be an institutional culture that supports that failure, that tries simply to fail forward, as the term goes, rather than to punish people for making a mistake. I think leaders can help create that context. I think maybe time for one more.
He asked my question.
Okay. Then I think Sandra has some closing words for us.